They want you to remember the love songs, not the damage left in their wake. For decades, the R&B machine has polished certain black legends into spotless saints while quietly burying the chaos that helped turn them into icons. The crooner who wrote anthems for women while secretly loving someone the world would have condemned him for. The superstar whose contract left him earning less than a fast food worker while his label counted millions. The concerts that looked like pure romance from the cheap seats, but according to people who were there, felt more like erotic rituals once the curtains closed. Car wrecks in the middle of the night, fans fainting in aisles, notebooks burned in hotel sinks, vaults locked, master tapes destroyed or hidden before dawn. On the surface, the story was always clean. The mess was scrubbed away before the morning news. And that leaves one question nobody in power wants to face out loud. If these legends were so loved, why did the industry work so relentlessly to bury their truth? The real stories were never lost. They were buried on purpose, filed away, sealed, protected. Tonight, we unseal a few of those files. And what you're about to hear may change the way every so-called love song sounds in your head. We start with the first secret, the one the industry hoped would stay buried forever. Because to grasp the truth behind Luther Vandross, you have to picture a man alone on stage, blinded by spotlights, singing about devotion, loyalty, lifelong commitment, while living a private life, convinced that real love could cost him everything. Luther's rise in the early 1980 seconds was explosive. His voice, that floating, velvet tenor, became the background to wedding receptions, anniversaries, slow dances in crowded living rooms. To millions, he sounded like the very definition of romance. But behind the ovations stood a man who moved cautiously through every corridor he entered. According to assistants from his never-too-much era, Luther dodged questions about his love life with a kind of practiced elegance. He would smile, tilt his head just slightly, fuss with a cufflink, and shift the conversation before anyone fully realized he'd done it. It did not look like shyness, it looked like strategy, and the people closest to him understood exactly why. Years later, Patti LaBelle would say in interviews what insiders had been whispering since the beginning. Luther was gay, and he chose silence to protect two things above all else: his career and his mother. Patti described late-night phone calls where Luther paced the floor, his voice trembling, telling her he could not come out. He believed the industry wasn't ready, and he believed his mother deserved to be shielded from the backlash and the hurt. This was not tabloid gossip. It was a friend speaking about another friend's heartbreak. Inside the business, however, the truth was not really a secret. It was simply not for public consumption. Musicians from his early tours have recalled that Luther seemed to truly exhale only when he was surrounded by a small, familiar circle of men who traveled with him from city to city. One backup vocalist has said she walked into a rehearsal room in 1986 and froze. Luther was sitting shoulder to shoulder with a particular songwriter, the two of them leaning over a shared lyric sheet, laughing softly, their heads nearly touching. The moment she stepped in, Luther straightened his posture, offered a polite smile, and changed the conversation. Whatever softness had been in the room vanished like a candle snuffed between two fingers. There were other stories, always shared quietly, never on the record. Rumors of a long-term connection with a male background singer from the busybody period. Talk of a private, emotionally intense bond with a producer during the Power of Love sessions in 1991. A pattern people claimed to notice on tour. Hotel floors reportedly arranged so his closest companions stayed only a few doors away, but never directly next door. A small but calculated move meant to skim under the radar. None of these moments were photographed. No grainy tabloid shots, no leaked camcorder clips. Not because they never happened, but because everyone inside his trusted circle, it was said, protected him with almost militant loyalty. They all understood what exposure could cost him. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, a black male balladeer could see his entire career collapse overnight if he was labeled too soft, too feminine, too queer, too unmarketable to women. Labels built fantasies around men like Luther, and fantasies had no space for complicated truths. Even the music, people later noticed, carried traces of the life he could not live in daylight. Those who studied Luther's handwritten lyric notes have pointed to recurring patterns: the unreachable, the forbidden, the love you can feel but cannot name. One engineer has recalled a late-night session in 1989 after Luther recorded "I Wonder." According to him, Luther stepped away from the microphone, wiped his face, and whispered, "Some feelings don't have a place in this world." Behind every soaring ballad stood a man who understood love with painful clarity, but was forced to experience it in silence. And that is the first secret. The greatest love singer of his generation never truly got to live the love he spent his life singing about. If the first secret was about silence, the second is about shackles. Not the iron ones preserved behind glass in museums, but the invisible kind hidden inside contracts typed in neat black ink and signed by young hands that had no idea what they were agreeing to. This is the chapter of R&B history the industry tried hardest to bury. How so many black legends were turned into glittering superstars on stage and quiet debtors everywhere else. The paper trail leads back to 1962. Motown was rising, the charts were changing, and the Marvelettes were already delivering hits. "Please, Mr. Postman" was echoing through radios across America. What fans didn't see was the numbers that followed. Those same young women, it was later revealed, were receiving royalty checks so small they could barely keep food in the refrigerator. Internal paperwork from that era would eventually show what insiders had long suspected. Motown's standard royalty rate hovered around roughly 7%, and groups had to divide that sliver among all members. By the time the manager took a percentage, the label recouped recording costs and touring expenses were subtracted. Artists sometimes ended up with almost nothing at all. The audience saw glitter. The bank accounts showed dust. The harshest impact fell on minors. Stevie Wonder, signed at just 11 years old, was reportedly given a modest weekly stipend, while Motown legally controlled his earnings until he turned 21. The money was not described as stolen. It was locked away under guardianship and business structures. But the image it created was brutally ironic, a child driving crowds into near hysteria, playing for thousands, while the paycheck everyone assumed he held never actually reached his hands in real time. The Jackson 5 story followed a similar script. When "I Want You Back" hit #1 in January 1970, the boys became global sensations overnight. Posters, lunchboxes, television specials, their faces were everywhere. Yet reports from people close to the situation said their weekly allowance hovered around $25 and some change, tightly controlled by both the label and their father. They performed in sold-out arenas, fueled entire marketing campaigns, and helped build a corporate empire. But the corporation, according to later accounts, kept almost everything: record sales, merchandise, television profits, while the kids at the center of the storm lived on controlled cash and strict permission. Then came the lawsuits, the quiet confrontations, the cracks in the image. In 1972, members of the Marvelettes filed complaints alleging unpaid royalties and missing accounting. A year later, in 1973, members of Martha and the Vandellas confronted Motown with claims that their master recordings were being repackaged in compilations without proper compensation. They did not publicly burn the label down, but those complaints, those legal filings, opened a file cabinet no one wanted to look into. Black women whose voices had helped build Motown itself, who could not match the life shown on their album covers, living close to paycheck while their songs generated millions. By the time the 1,990 seconds arrived, the game hadn't changed. Only the scale had. Toni Braxton's story is proof. She sold more than 10 million copies of her first 2 albums. Her voice was everywhere on radio, television, award stages. But on the 2nd of December 1998, Toni Braxton filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Court documents later reported by major outlets showed something almost impossible to believe. She had received less than $2,000 in royalty income, while her label, LaFace Arista, pulled in tens of millions from her success. When Toni pushed back and filed suit in December 1997, claiming unfair accounting and exploitative contract terms, the response was swift and punishing. The label countersued for breach of contract, demanding millions from her. The message to the rest of the industry was clear: challenge the system, and the system will come for you. Whispers began to circulate in boardrooms and green rooms. Executives and media figures painted her as reckless, ungrateful, bad with money. Morning talk shows joked about her spending habits. Magazine headlines implied she had ruined herself. But buried in the court filings was a different story. Her contract paid pennies per album, and nearly every cost — music videos, stylists, tour buses, hotel suites — was deducted from her already thin slice. By the time the math was done, the woman whose music defined an era was left with scraps. Behind closed doors, the real word circulating through the industry was recoupment. It was the label's favorite tool. If a company spent $1 million promoting an artist, that million didn't come out of the label's profits. It came out of the artist's share. From the moment the pen touched the contract, every step forward also created a new kind of debt. Success itself became a bill that had to be paid back. It was said that some of the most haunting stories never made it to headlines. Insiders quietly claimed that a handful of R&B icons from the 1,960 Seconds and 1,970 Seconds died still waiting for full royalty statements on their biggest hits. There were rumors of estates discovering that a lifetime of recording and touring added up to barely enough to cover funeral costs. Managers, according to people who were there, sometimes had to beg labels to release overdue checks to widows and children, only to be told that the accounts were still under review. One former Motown employee later claimed in a private interview that during the 1,980 Seconds, a filing cabinet on the third floor held royalty statements for artists who never saw them. When asked why those payments were never processed, he allegedly answered with a sentence that still hangs over the label's legacy: some contracts were never designed to pay out. By the late 1,990 Seconds, other stories began to leak out in hushed tones. Producers and insiders said Toni Braxton was not alone. According to one veteran producer, for every artist like Toni who took the fight public, there were several others with multi-platinum plaques on their walls and almost nothing in their accounts, choosing silence because they were afraid of being blacklisted or shelved. It is not the glamorous version of R&B history. It is the version built on broken accounting, muffled protests, legends smiling for cameras while quietly drowning in debt. And that is the second secret. The music made millions, just not for the people whose voices filled the songs. Some secrets don't start in shadow, they start in applause. And in soul music history, nothing was louder, hotter, or more overwhelming than a Teddy Pendergrass ladies-only concert in the late 1,970 Seconds. To understand what those nights really were, you have to see them the way reporters described them back then, not simply as shows, but as ceremonies. Not mere performances, but emotional eruptions. The first official ladies-only event took place in 1977. The promotion was quiet, almost like a test. Promoters expected a strong turnout, a full house, maybe some extra security just in case. What they got instead, according to coverage from the time, was something closer to hysteria. Women flooded the aisles before Teddy even touched the microphone. Then he stepped into the spotlight-tailored suit. Slow, knowing grin, that baritone rolling out like thunder, and the room seemed to detonate. Screams, tears, outstretched arms. One newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle, later reported that more than a dozen fans fainted before he finished his second song. By 1978 and 1979, the ladies-only shows weren't just concerts. They were an institution. Teddy's camp began handing out Teddy treats, small chocolates, stamped with his initials on the wrapper. Women threw lingerie on stage, not as a gimmick, but as an offering. EMT crews were stationed in venues because, according to The Guardian and other outlets, multiple women had passed out or needed medical attention at prior shows. Critics started asking whether Teddy had unintentionally invented a new form of soul worship, something between a concert, a revival, and a riot of desire. Backstage had its own mythology. Crew members would later describe walking through hallways lined with gifts, perfume bottles, handwritten notes, and piles of abandoned clothing left behind in the frenzy. There was also one persistent rumor, never officially confirmed or denied: Teddy's tour trunk. It was said that he traveled with a large steamer case, heavy and always locked, that followed him from city to city. Some people claimed it was stuffed with fan letters and intimate keepsakes. Others believed it held more personal mementos he refused to let out of his sight. The truth of what was inside has never been publicly proven, leaving it one of soul music's quiet, enduring mysteries. But the darkest turn in Teddy's story did not happen on stage. It came on the 18th of March, 1982, at around 1:30 a.m. on Lincoln Drive in Philadelphia. Teddy's Rolls-Royce slammed into a guardrail. The impact was violent. He survived, but the crash left him paralyzed from the chest down. The accident instantly became national news, not only because of its severity, but because of the confusion and speculation that circled it. Police reports confirmed the identity of the passenger, but the public spun its own narratives. Some people claimed Teddy had been living too fast, that fate had finally collected a debt, that the crash was a kind of cosmic punishment for the erotic spectacle of his ladies-only era. None of those theories were fair, and many were rooted more in projection than fact. But they revealed something important. By then, people weren't just reacting to Teddy Pendergrass the man. They were reacting to Teddy Pendergrass the symbol. His sexuality, his dominance on stage, his myth had grown larger than the person inside it. When the wheelchair replaced the prowling figure in the spotlight, many assumed his career would quietly fade. Instead, Teddy returned to the studio and the stage with a different intensity. He continued recording, performing, and redefining what survival looked like for a soul icon. His legacy, in the end, was built not on rumors, but on resilience. Still, the whispers never entirely stopped, because those ladies-only concerts weren't just shows you bought tickets to. They were glimpses into a kind of emotional overload that bordered on the unreal, nights so charged that, even now, people who were there still argue over what exactly they witnessed: just a concert or something far more unsettling. To understand Whitney Houston's secret, you have to start with the image. The carefully manufactured, relentlessly polished image of America's sweetheart. The brilliant smile on The Tonight Show. The shimmering gowns. The radio-friendly sound engineered to glide across every boundary of race, genre, and format. On the surface, she was flawless. Behind that surface was a woman fighting to hold on to pieces of herself the industry kept trying to take away. In the mid-1980 seconds, Whitney's career didn't just rise, it was deployed. Arista Records marketed her with almost military precision as the ultimate crossover idol, a voice rooted in gospel, sanded down for pop, and wrapped in a presentation light enough for mainstream America's comfort. The strategy worked. It also had a cost. As The Atlantic and other outlets later reported, anything that read as too black, too street, too raw was quietly stripped from the plan. Public relations teams softened her appearance, straightened her hair, and refined every visible angle of her life. Photo shoots were curated, interviews were controlled, even laughter had to fit the brand. And then there was Robin Crawford, the person who complicated that perfectly drawn picture more than any tabloid headline ever could. Robin wasn't just a friend. She was Whitney's closest confidant, her anchor, the woman whose presence subtly altered every room Whitney walked into. Their bond began in 1980, long before the superstardom. They lived together, worked together, and according to Robin's later memoir, shared a connection that was deep, loving, and foundational, even if she chose her words carefully when describing it. People who worked backstage with them throughout the 1,980 seconds said their closeness was obvious. When Whitney laughed, Robin often laughed with her. When Whitney was overwhelmed, Robin was the one steadying her shoulders, wiping her tears, managing the chaos. To many in their orbit, this wasn't scandal. It was simply how Whitney's world had always been arranged. The industry, however, saw it differently. As Whitney's fame exploded, insiders claimed that executives grew increasingly nervous. They worried that her visible proximity to Robin would feed speculation, spark tabloid headlines, and threaten the delicate crossover image they had invested so heavily in. In an era obsessed with marketability and middle America, any hint of ambiguity was treated like a threat. Several crew members from the 1987, 1988 tour later recalled subtle shifts. Robin, they said, was nudged out of certain photo ops, left off call sheets for key meetings, or reassigned on travel plans that once would have kept her glued to Whitney's side. One staffer remembered the tension in the air and summed it up in one line. "It wasn't personal, it was business. They wanted her to look a certain way." End quote. Whispers began that Whitney had been given a choice, an unspoken ultimatum: maintain the fairy tale princess image or risk losing sponsorships, brand deals, and touring support. No contract surfaced to prove such a demand was ever written down, but behavior around her changed. Creative directors have said that visual concepts Whitney loved were dismissed as too masculine, too edgy, too far off the America's sweetheart path. Choreography was reportedly softened. Wardrobe options were altered at the last minute. One music video treatment in 1991 was said to have been scrapped entirely because it didn't align with the sanitized narrative executives needed to sell. None of these decisions became public scandals. They lived only in production meetings, in late-night rehearsals, in quiet arguments behind closed doors. The real damage wasn't just professional, it was personal. By the early 1990 seconds, those close to the situation say Robin's role in Whitney's life had been reduced under immense pressure. Their friendship shifted, reshaped by forces they couldn't fully control. Phone calls grew shorter. Their public appearances together became rarer. Whitney was left carrying an invisible weight, forced to choose between the world she had conquered and the person who knew her most intimately. The fans saw the magazine covers, the red carpets, the movie premieres. They didn't see the war happening inside her, a war between truth and expectation, between her own sense of self and the version of Whitney Houston that executives, marketers, and audiences demanded. And that is Whitney's hidden tragedy. She possessed one of the greatest voices of her generation, but she moved through an industry that made it clear. Even her truth had to whisper. To understand this next secret, you have to picture a man walking through two worlds at the same time. James Brown, the godfather of soul, an unstoppable force on stage, an ongoing emergency off it. What makes his story so unsettling isn't just the drugs, the violence, or the arrests themselves. It's the way the machinery around him kept humming, even as everything else in his life was clearly breaking down. Throughout the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, Brown's personal life turned into a storm that police departments, judges, and concert promoters all found themselves circling. Reports from CBS News, Time, and other outlets described patterns that would have ended most entertainers' careers outright. Domestic violence allegations, frequent cocaine use, PCP-fueled paranoia, and sudden, impulsive acts that blurred the line between self-destruction and performance. One of the most infamous episodes took place on the 24th of September 1988. According to news coverage at the time, Brown, allegedly high on PCP, burst into an insurance seminar next to his office in Augusta, carrying a shotgun and accusing attendees of using his private restroom without permission. When the police responded, Brown didn't surrender. He got in his pickup, fled the scene, and triggered a high-speed chase that tore across Georgia and South Carolina, reportedly hitting speeds over 90 miles per hour. Patrol cars boxed him in. Windows were shattered. Tires were blown out. By the end, Brown was dragged from the vehicle and arrested on multiple charges. And yet, here is the part that still raises questions. Despite receiving a 6-year sentence, he served just over 2 years before being released. Promoters at the time quietly suggested there was an unspoken fear among officials that locking him away for the full term would spark backlash or cost certain cities millions in lost tour revenue. It was never written in any official memo, but the suspicion lingered. James Brown might have been too valuable to keep behind bars for long. The pattern around his personal relationships was even more disturbing. Court documents from the early 1982 detail repeated accusations of domestic violence from wives and partners. The outcomes, according to legal records and press reports, were often the same: fines, suspended sentences, counseling orders. What stayed absent, over and over, were long-term consequences. Members of his touring crew would later voice the thought many had been afraid to say out loud. If an ordinary man with no fame had done what James Brown was accused of doing, he likely would have disappeared into the system. Brown, instead, kept returning to the stage. The industry's reaction was a mix of denial and damage control. Sometimes it looked like gentle avoidance. Other times, according to people who were there, it was more direct. When Brown's volatile behavior threatened scheduled shows, promoters allegedly leaned on local authorities to be reasonable, to try and keep matters from escalating into anything that would cancel a tour date. A booking agent from that era recalled one incident from 1983 after Brown was detained for allegedly brandishing a weapon at a road manager. The message that came down, he said, was simple: handle it quietly. The show must go on. And it did, almost every time. Then there were the darker whispers, the ones no one wanted on the record. It was rumored that in some cases, charges seemed to soften or vanish after Brown agreed to perform benefit concerts or special appearances for local officials. There were stories that record executives made late-night phone calls to smooth out legal trouble, urging leniency because there was too much money on the line. None of these claims were conclusively proven in court, but the overall pattern of soft landings was hard to ignore. The tragedy at the core of James Brown's story is not just that he spiraled, it is that the people and systems around him, from law enforcement to industry executives, often refused to stop the spiral as long as the cash kept flowing. Every mugshot, every courtroom appearance, every frightening headline was followed by another booking, another arena, another payday, another crowd screaming his name. James Brown wasn't treated as untouchable because he was innocent. According to many who watched it unfold, he was treated as untouchable because he was profitable. And that is the next secret. Sometimes in the world of soul and R&B, accountability bends when the money is loud enough. This is the secret the industry prayed no artist would ever drag into the light. The trap hidden inside glittering award shows, red carpets, and walls lined with platinum plaques. Because Toni Braxton, one of the most recognizable voices of the 1990 seconds, sold more than 10 million records before discovering that, on paper, she was essentially broke. The tragedy didn't begin with a scandal. It began quietly. After the breakthrough of her 1993 debut and the massive success of its 1996 follow-up, the world assumed Toni was drowning in money. She was everywhere, winning Grammys, topping charts, touring stadiums, becoming a soundtrack for an entire decade. To the public, that kind of visibility automatically meant wealth. But the royalty statements from LaFace, Arista told a different story. According to documents later cited by major outlets, Toni had received less than $2,000 in royalty income at the peak of her fame, less than a used car, while the label earned tens of millions off her voice. In December 1997, she finally pushed back. Toni filed a lawsuit accusing the label of unfair accounting and predatory contract terms. What came next showed other artists exactly what they risked when they dared to fight the system. Arista countersued for breach of contract, demanding millions from her. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Industry insiders whispered that she was ungrateful. Executives painted her as difficult. Commentators called her financially irresponsible. Instead of asking how a multi-platinum artist could end up with nothing, the press fixated on her spending, her shopping habits, her so-called bad choices. But the court filings told a colder story. Her contract paid pennies per album, and nearly every major expense: music videos, hair, makeup, wardrobe, tour buses, hotel rooms, was charged back to her share. The bigger her success, the larger the bill attached to it. By the 2nd of December 1998, with no way out and pressure from every direction, Toni Braxton filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Tabloids had their punchline: Morning shows made her a cautionary tale. They joked about her, not about the system. Few asked the question that mattered. How does a woman who sells tens of millions of records end up with less money than a mid-level office worker? Behind closed doors, the executives already knew the answer. Recoupment. Recoupment was the industry's favorite weapon, a word most fans would never hear, but every artist would feel. If the label spent $1 million on promotion, that million wasn't treated as the company's investment, it was treated as the artist's debt, paid back not in cash, but in future royalties that might never materialize in their hands. The moment the pen hit the contract, success became a kind of trap. Every chart-topping single, every sold-out arena, each glossy magazine cover looked like progress to the outside world. But on the inside, all of it could be itemized, billed, and used to justify why the artist still owed the label money. What made this secret even heavier were the stories that never reached the public. Throughout the late 1992, insiders claimed Toni was far from alone. There were whispers of other R&B stars who had multi-platinum albums on their walls, yet saw shockingly small checks. They didn't sue. They didn't go public. They stayed quiet. One veteran producer is said to have put it this way in private: for every Toni Braxton who spoke up, there were 5 who stayed silent because they were afraid of getting blacklisted. They had watched what happened when someone challenged the system. They chose survival over truth. The most chilling layer came after Toni's bankruptcy was finalized. She later revealed that she had to buy back personal belongings, awards, tour costumes, even gifts she had given to family members because they had been seized and categorized as assets. Items that symbolized her success were laid out like inventory, price-tagged, and sold off. In interviews, her voice sometimes shook as she described the humiliation. She said she felt punished for succeeding, punished for trusting that the spotlight meant security. This wasn't just bad luck or poor financial planning. It was a structure operating exactly as designed. Toni Braxton wasn't the first artist whose own success was weaponized against her, but she was one of the first of her era to drag that weapon into the daylight, to force the public to see what was written in the fine print, even when it cost her almost everything. Some secrets in soul music aren't hidden in darkness. They're hidden in contradiction. And few contradictions are more haunting than the double life of Al Green. Before he stepped into the pulpit, before the white suits and choir robes, before he became the Reverend Al Green, he was known for something else entirely. A dangerous kind of passion, not the soft, romantic passion of his records, the messy, consuming, unpredictable kind that trailed him through the 1,970 seconds. Lovers from that era have described him as magnetic yet volatile, tender one moment and distant the next. Friends said he moved through life like a man convinced that if an emotion didn't burn, it wasn't real. The night that changed everything came on the 18th of October 1974, a date stamped permanently into soul music history. That night, at his Memphis home, Al Green's girlfriend, Mary Woodson, attacked him with a pot of scalding water. The liquid hit his back and chest, causing severe burns that would leave permanent scars. Minutes later, while the chaos was still unfolding, Mary died from what investigators ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police closed the case quickly, but emotionally, nothing about that night ever truly closed. The tragedy didn't come from some elaborate mystery. It came from a relationship that, according to reporters and those close to them, had become increasingly volatile jealousy, sudden departures, tearful reconciliations, and arguments that seemed to come out of nowhere. People in their orbit said that after the incident, Al looked permanently altered, as if something essential inside him had shattered. Then came the whispers, quiet, never fully confirmed, but repeated enough to linger. Some crew members and associates claimed Al believed what happened was a form of divine punishment for the life he had been living. The affairs, the tangled romances, the women who argued over him at shows. They said he lay in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice, convinced the message was painfully clear. Within a year, the shift became visible. Al Green began moving away from secular music, easing into gospel performances, talking more openly about God, redemption, and discipline. By 1976, he had become an ordained minister, The narrative looked clean from the outside, a tortured soul transformed, a sinner turned shepherd. But the split was never as neat as the public story suggested. That's the part the industry rarely dwells on. Even as he preached on Sundays, insiders say Al still wrestled privately with the same temptations and impulses that had shaped his earlier years. It was not a sudden, perfect conversion. It was a tug-of-war. Those who toured with him during his late 70 Seconds gospel years have described moments backstage when he seemed to vanish into himself, standing over a sink, gripping the edge, staring into the mirror as if arguing silently with his reflection. Some musicians recall him whispering prayers under his breath, talking about the devil, testing him through memory, through the faces, the nights, the emotions that refused to disappear. There were other rumors too, not lurid, but painfully human. People close to him said Al sometimes revisited his past in small, secret rituals, old letters, faded photos, mementos he couldn't bring himself to throw away. One former assistant has claimed she once found him sitting alone in the dark with a box of photographs on his lap, tears sliding down his face, while a radio in the corner played one of his own love songs. Al Green's story is not just another scandal file. It's the story of a man trapped between two worlds that would not stop pulling on him, the pulpit and the past, salvation and desire. A man who tried to bury one life inside another, only to learn that trauma does not pay attention to the doors you close. You can walk away from the stage. You can put on a different suit. You can trade nightclubs for church pews. But unresolved pain does not disappear just because you change the soundtrack. Sometimes it follows you straight into the sanctuary. Some secrets in the music industry aren't buried in darkness at all. They're pressed directly into vinyl, encoded in digital files, hiding in plain sound waves. They live inside the very songs people slow danced to, cried to, kissed to, and built entire memories around. One of the ugliest truths behind a long list of R&B and dance classics is this: the voice the world fell in love with hasn't always belonged to the face on the cover. The first major crack in that illusion came from a case that finally went public: Martha Wash. Between 1989 and 1991, she recorded what were supposed to be guide vocals, reference takes, meant only for demos. But those demos weren't discarded. Her powerhouse voice was used almost verbatim on major dance and R&B hits, while a slim, photogenic model appeared in the videos, lip-syncing in her place. Martha had to sue just to reclaim ownership of her own sound and force the industry to admit what it had done. That case didn't invent the problem. It confirmed what insiders said they had been whispering for decades. If a label decided a singer's face didn't fit the fantasy, they could keep the voice and hide the person behind it. The deeper R&B secrets were even more carefully disguised. In Detroit, Motown veterans have admitted that during the 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds, many girl group hits were quietly reinforced or, in some cases, fully carried by the Andantes, a trio of uncredited background vocalists. These women reportedly recorded more than 20,000 vocal parts. Their harmonies were layered over or under official group members, filling out choruses and tightening hooks. On certain records, if you stripped away the branding, you would find the Andantes singing where the credited stars were supposed to be. In Los Angeles, engineers from the early 90 seconds have described a different version of the same story. Late at night, an unknown session singer would be called in. She'd record an entire lead, full verses, full choruses, ad-libs, stacks of harmonies. Days later, the credited star would arrive, sing just enough lines to blend with the existing performance, and leave. In the final mix, the session singer's voice was still there, supporting, stabilizing, doing the heavy lifting, but buried just enough to keep her invisible. One backing vocalist from a multi-platinum late 80 Seconds album later recognized her own tone on the finished record. Not just a note here or there, entire lines folded into the mix. She had been paid a few $100s and signed an NDA that forbade her from ever speaking publicly about it. She watched her voice rocket up the charts under someone else's name. Stories circulated about specific moments. Whispers that Casey and JoJo quietly swapped lines on certain tracks without proper credit. claims that a piercing high note on one of En Vogue's Funky Divas cuts was actually sung by a powerful in-house vocalist at Warner who remained uncredited. Tales of early Uptown Records sessions where CeCe Peniston's demo runs were allegedly left intact because no one could outsing what she had already laid down. These weren't treated as wild conspiracy theories among the people who worked in those rooms. They lived in studio logs, in faded track sheets, in the memories of engineers who watched raw performances, sliced, looped, and reassigned. They survived as whispered warnings to new singers. If you hear your own voice on the radio one day and your name isn't on the record, remember you signed the paper. The darkest part of this secret was never just the theft. It was the erasure. Voices that built hooks, carried choruses, and turned decent songs into undeniable hits were erased the moment the red recording light clicked off. Their names never made it into liner notes. Their faces never appeared in videos. Their contributions disappeared behind contracts and non-disclosure agreements. If you could somehow mute the backing tracks on certain legendary R&B records, if you could strip away the polish and isolate the raw stems, the truth, according to those who were there, would rise like a ghost. You'd hear a stranger's voice carrying someone else's fame. The final secret is the most brutal because it doesn't hide in contracts, boardrooms, or royalty statements. It hides in flesh and bone. It hides in lungs that can't catch air, knees that won't hold, voices that crack under lights they were too sick to stand beneath. Behind the glittering facade of R&B tours sits a machine that has spent decades grinding its stars past the point of collapse. Whitney Houston's decline was documented almost like a live autopsy. In June 2001, at the Michael Jackson 30th anniversary concert, she walked on stage, looking fragile, gaunt, trembling, a shadow of the unshakable powerhouse the world remembered. According to people who later spoke about it, Whitney had begged to cancel. The penalties for pulling out were too steep. The show went on. Nearly a decade later, during her 2010 European tour, the pattern repeated in a crueler form. She struggled for breath mid-song, fought through coughing fits in front of thousands, reached for high notes her younger self could hit without effort, and watched them slip away. Fans recorded shaky clips from the audience, moments of a legend visibly fighting her own body. Those videos spread online before Sony allegedly moved quietly to purchase and scrub several of them, trying to soften the damage and control the narrative. Aretha Franklin faced her own war with the clock and the fine print. Ill for years, she kept performing because her contracts required a minimum number of songs per show. In Chicago in 2012, witnesses say she nearly collapsed in the middle of a set. She went backstage, took oxygen, steadied herself, then forced her way back out to finish the last required minutes. Not for the joy of the music, but so a promoter wouldn't activate a penalty clause. Beyond the megastars, the stories grow even darker. Tour medics from the late 1990 seconds have described being called in just minutes before curtain time to hook IV lines into dehydrated singers. They pushed fluids into arms so weak the artist could barely lift a microphone. They only needed to stand, one medic reportedly said later. No one cared what happened to them after the lights went down. And Tina Turner, more rock than R&B, but bound to the same brutal economics, became one of the industry's harshest cautionary examples. In Berlin in March 1985, burning with fever, she still walked onto the stage and delivered a 2-hour set because canceling would have triggered tens of thousands of dollars in arena penalties and fees. The body protested. The contract won. Through the 2000s, similar scenes repeated across R&B. Some stars stumbled through disastrous performances, lyrics forgotten, words slurring, eyes blank with exhaustion. According to production staff, labels scrambled in the background, trying to buy up or suppress footage before it could go viral and damage a brand they were still profiting from. In one case, whispered among crew members as a horror story, a singer collapsed unconscious backstage just before showtime. When she finally came to, she whispered 2 words, "I can't." Management's response, witnesses said, was chillingly simple. They lifted her to her feet and told her, "Just walk out there. The rest we'll handle." She went on anyway. The crowd never saw the hands holding her upright in the wings. The cruelty was consistent. contracts stacked with penalties so severe that sick performers chose pain over financial ruin. Shows that continued even as the person at the center was visibly unraveling. Reputations and brands protected at the expense of human bodies. A veteran tour manager once summed up the mindset with a single sentence that still hangs over the business. They never asked if the artist was okay. They asked if the audience had already bought tickets. In the end, some R&B legends were not undone by scandal, addiction, or fame itself. They were undone by labor, relentless, grinding, unforgiving work, demanded by an industry that did not see them as people, but as engines that were never allowed to shut down. You've just walked through a landscape the industry never wanted in focus. A back room behind the billboards, a place where some of the most celebrated black R&B legends lived double lives, not because they craved secrecy, but because the system left them no other way to survive. You've seen where voices were taken, reshaped, and reassigned, where bodies were pushed until they buckled, where contracts were engineered not just to pay slowly, but to drain relentlessly, where private pain was stripped of context, polished, and sold back to the public as entertainment. These weren't random tragedies or isolated cautionary tales. They formed a repeating pattern, woven into the very operating code of the business. Think about what you've just walked through, a superstar pouring his soul into love songs while hiding who he really was, knowing the truth could end everything. A label turning artists into long-term debtors, employees trapped in a maze of recoupment clauses they never fully understood, concerts that blurred from shows into frenzies, car crashes that didn't just injure bodies but rewrote entire legacies overnight. Ghost vocalists whose names will never be printed on a trophy or engraved on a plaque. Singers pushed back onto stages when, by every human measure, they should have been lying in hospital beds. Footage quietly bought, buried, or locked away, less to protect the artist, more to shield the brand that profited from their collapse. None of this fits on glossy posters. It doesn't fit inside a 3-minute radio edit or a neatly packaged documentary special. But these things happened. And once you've seen the underbelly, the shine at the top never looks quite the same. This isn't just a story about money or fame. It's a story about erasure and protection, about who gets written out of the narrative and who gets shielded at all costs. It's about the artists who became icons but paid for that status with their health, their identities, their relationships, and sometimes their sanity. It's about a machine that kept running at full speed, even when the people trapped inside it were clearly coming apart. And now, the weight of what to do with this doesn't fall on the labels or the executives. It falls on you, the listener, who has finally seen what was hiding just behind the curtain. So here is the real question. Which moment lodged itself in you and refused to move? Was it the invisible singers who built hits they could never publicly claim? Was it the artists shoved back on stage minutes after collapsing? Was it the contracts quietly designed to leave million-selling performers effectively bankrupt? Or the stories of legends allowed to spiral simply because they were too profitable to interrupt? And here's a harder one. Do you believe those patterns truly ended? Or did they simply evolve into something smoother, more polished, harder to detect? Look at today's stars. Look at the pace, the relentless output, the carefully curated smiles, the endlessly polished appearances. Do you honestly think the machine learned compassion? Or just learned how to hide its damage better? Tell me what you notice now. Tell me which secret permanently changed the way you hear their music. Tell me which detail made you stop the video, sit in silence, or feel anger rising in your chest. Your voice is the one thing the industry cannot own, silence or recoup. Use it. Leave a comment. Call out the moment that shook you. And if you want the next sealed file cracked open, make sure you're subscribed because there are more stories buried in these archives.